In my 10 years as program director for the New York Open Center, I never heard a talk that was too short, or a Q&A that was too long. So mindful of that, I want to leave lots of time for questions this talk may well inspire. And as you might readily imagine, a speaker who not only wrote a book entitled The Illusion of Will, Self, and Time, but actually believes that, questions abound. Some of the screen images will therefore fly by at reckless speed, but all of them can be later reviewed if you want on the YouTube recording. If it's not obvious why I felt the topic of God as a circle is worth exploring with this church, it surely would have been to the great psychedelic explorer Terence McKenna, who, when he walked into San Francisco's Grace Cathedral under the influence of LSD, had a religious epiphany, realizing they'd gotten it all wrong. It was the rose window that was God. For the next 25 minutes, I want to corroborate that epiphany, guided by the much-cited title phrase, God is a circle whose center is everywhere and circumference is nowhere. Much cited, though of uncertain origin. It has sometimes, with the substitution of sphere for circle, been attributed to many sources east and west, including Hermes Trismegistus, Empedocles, an anonymous 13th century philosopher, and quoted by many more, including the uber, though ex-Unitarian himself, Ralph Waldo Emerson, who quotes it in his essay Circles, attributing it to St. Augustine. That attribution is false, profoundly false, since Augustine, brilliant thinker though he was the opposite of a circle guy. One might even call him the father of linearity. And we will have more to say about that, but for now, don't let that halo fool you. But more importantly than the phrase's origin is the phrase's meaning. I do believe the most authentic first response to hearing God is a circle whose center is everywhere and circumference is nowhere is, huh? And since we actually don't know who originated this phrase, I have taken the liberty of making a second response that instantly, I believe, renders the quote more intelligible. God is a circle whose center is everywhere and circumference is no identifiable somewhere. With this revision, we still preserve the ultimate unknowableness of whatever it is we conceive or imagine as God, but discard the impossible notion of a circle without a circumference. Of course, we still keep what many might more immediately object to, the radical reductionism, if not absurdity, of defining God in terms of a geometrical shape. Especially those in the Judeo-Christian tradition who conceive of God as far more dynamic than this ultimate abstraction seems to allow. My necessarily quick response to that objection has been around for several millennia. The ancient Rig Veda, far anticipating the Judeo-Christian assumption of a creator God initiating a world from darkness by darkness hidden, asked these questions. What stirred? Where? In whose protection? Who really knows? Who will here proclaim it? Whence was it produced? Whence is this creation? Questions that have yet, I submit, to get a slam dunk answer. A circle God, of course, assumes no such creative start, or any start at all for that matter, cohering rather with the non-dual, unborn beginningless God of the Upanishads. For a centerpoint and circumference are mutually defining. Indeed, the only way to know one is to know the other, which makes it an intriguing version of the great saying of the Upanishads, Tattvamasi, that thou art. This ultimate statement of the relationship between the absolute and the individual is the foundation of the preeminent non-dual doctrine, Advaita, of Adi Shankara, and is frequently depicted as a circle. And in our consideration of tat famasi as the nature of God or the Absolute, whose shape we are here proposing, we don't need to abandon the Western tradition. As William James pointed out, introducing tat famasi into his classic and still widely read text, The Varieties of Religious Experience, this overcoming of all the usual barriers between the individual and the absolute is the great mystic achievement. In mystic states, we both become one with the absolute and we become aware of our oneness. This, James said, is the everlasting and triumphant mystical tradition, hardly altered by differences of clime or creed. In Hinduism, in Neoplatonism, in Sufism, in Christian mysticism, in Whitmanism, we find the same recurring note, perpetually telling of the unity of man with God. James could well have also included his godfather, Emerson, whose non-dual belief, the seer and the seen are one, he also identified with the tat famasi god Brahman in his poem of that name. They reckon ill who leave me out. When me they fly, I am the wings. I am the doubter and the doubt, and I the hymn the Brahman sings. And another prominent Western-based endorsement of this same non-dual divinity was given by Michael Talbot in the conclusion of his now classic text, The Holographic Universe. Out there is only the indivisible totality, Brahman. The radical non-dual unity of subject and object, and all manifestation as single-sourced in God, gives, I believe, the most plausible, if not compelling support for consideration of God the circle. All points on the circumference only existing as such in relation to the center point, and the center point only existing in relation to every point on the circumference. Of course, this divine circularization can never be more than a conceptual ordering of an ultimately unperceivable, unobjectifiable whole, for, in agreement with the great 20th century theologian Paul Tillich, God is not a being, but being itself. Consistent with God the circle, Tillich goes on to say that the ultimate concept of God must embrace all being. Otherwise, we are left with a relative God, like Zeus, who was subservient to fate. But again, we do not need to leave our Western heritage behind to encounter versions of such an all-embracing, non-dual, non-relative God or absolute, especially conceivable as circular. The 6th century BCE Greek philosopher Xenophanes, for one, had already identified as the greatest amongst all gods, not at all like mortals in body or in thought, of whom, in keeping with a non-subservient being, it can be said, whole he sees, whole he thinks, and whole he hears. This greatest amongst gods fits God the circle, with a fixed center point defining the circumferal whole. For as Xenophanes goes on to elaborate, always he abides in the same place, not moving at all, nor is it seemly for him to travel to different places at different times. God the circle, of course, would not need to travel to different places, because those circumferal places and the center point mutually define and establish each other. And the Greeks, including the pre-Socratics, Plato, the Neoplatonists, and the Eastern Orthodox Church Fathers, readily conceived of divinity as circular. Pythagoras not only held that the most beautiful figure is the sphere among solids and the circle among plane figures, he drew attention to the special sacred quality of the leaves of the mallow plant. Though no one knows why for sure, his biographer, Iamblichus, tells us that the mallow plant, for Pythagoras, is the first sign of the sympathy between heavenly and earthly beings. And if that is not enough to qualify its round shape, radiating out from a center point as divine symbolism, a mutually sympathetic, indeed defining, relationship between a center point and its circumference. We know that the circle dot, representing the monad, a Greek word meaning solitary unit, was conceived by the Pythagoreans and later Greeks as the absolute or prime metaphysical being. And Parmenides, Father Parmenides to Plato, and the only philosopher he called deep, bathos, not only conceived of ultimate reality, what is, as complete on every side, like a well-rounded sphere, from a center point equally matched everywhere, but also, in anticipation of Einstein's spherical block universe, utterly unchanging. And of course there is Plotinus's center-pointed radiating one, not to be confused with his conception of God, although eventually it was, but originally a far more abstract concept of an all-embracing unity, in which what the center is like is revealed through the radii as if it were unfolded without having been unfolded. With this rich circular heritage, it is no wonder that the 6th century Greek Christian saint Dorotheus of Gaza would import God the circle into his newly forming post-pagan religion, with God being the center point of a circumference, though a circumference whose radii he did not fully identify as also God, but rather as the paths of human lives. Early Greek Orthodox Christian theology had perhaps neither retained enough of its non-dual Greek ancestry, nor yet absorbed enough of non-dual Christian mysticism to consider God the center point and circumference as dual aspects of one unity. Circles, of course, have been the most commonly employed spiritual symbols, east and west, for millennia, traditional or esoteric. William James, I believe, gives one of the best examples of why that may be with his own circle offering. Not a rose window, but its structural facsimile. The windrose on a compass. And I will use it as a compass to help guide us toward a clearer understanding of circularity as divinity. Like the windrose on a compass, James asks, may not we form the margin of some more really central self in things which is co-conscious with the whole of us? May not you and I be confluent in a higher consciousness, though we know it not? Conceived as such, any continuity, let alone causality, between adjacent points on the margin, aka circumference, are derived solely from the relation to the shared center point, not from a direct line between the points themselves, for there are no straight lines anywhere on a circle, no matter how infinitesimal. You can draw a straight line through a circle, but not through two immediately adjacent points on it. A straight line restricted to the circle's circumference can connect with one point only, before veering off in a tangent. Every moment takes place on a circumference, but since the size of the circumference is unknowable, we can never know what might be coming next, based on what has come before. Although we seem always to move forward in time, just as we most often do in space, how often does what seems will be the inevitable next moment turn out differently than we anticipated, or suddenly involve many more steps than anticipated before it does happen? In the latter case, the circumference, that no identifiable somewhere, was larger than we had imagined. Likewise, when a goal is reached with fewer steps than anticipated, the circumference is smaller. But although we do not know the size of the circumference, we can feel ourselves on it, rather than drifting away on a tangent, whenever we realize that the relation between one moment and the next is not accessed by a straight line between them, but by their mutual relation to one center point. This feeling of center point sourcing arises whenever we experience what spiritual adepts and meditators know as the gap between thoughts. As Krishnamurti put it, though the response, the movement of thought, seem so swift. There are gaps. There are intervals between thoughts. Between two thoughts, there is a period of silence which is not related to the thought process. Just as light, we know since Einstein, does not consist of a continuous stream, but rather is a succession of indivisible whole units or quanta of energy, so does its sibling, consciousness, actually pulse in a series of gap-filled whole moments, including whatever apparent object it is conscious of. As the great neuropsychological researcher and theorist Jason Brown put it, in order for an object to exist as a solid, it must recur over successive durations. This is true for all perceptions, though it is more emphatic in some modalities than others. It may not be obvious that a tree, like any visual object, must be perceived over a succession of occasions for it to be perceived at all. The ongoing gap in consciousness, always there to be accessed as a gap between thoughts, is a sourcing of fundamental depth that drops one down, as if through a trapdoor, from the seemingly seamless surface of linear time. As Brown so elegantly puts it, oneness is not the coming together of God and mystic, but the reaching down to the foundations of thought before the surfacing of individuality. We could say that to the degree that the surfacing of individuality is felt to be on a linear path, we are treading a tangent line, disconnected from the foundation of thought. To imagine further what it might be like to take more than a few steps, not as we are accustomed, as individuated selves, forging a linear path in an indifferent object universe, consider one of Emerson's greatest disciples, Walt Whitman, who says, "Each moment and whatever happens thrills me with joy. One and all are to me miracles, the whole referring, yet each distinct and in its place. To me, every hour of the light and dark is a miracle." Becoming identified with the source of moments, reaching down to the foundations of thought before the surfacing of individuality, Whitman loses the sense of surface agency without losing the sense of the surface itself. The whole referring, yet each distinct and in its place, is repeatedly emphasized by Whitman. The universe is duly in order. Everything is in its place. What has arrived is in its place, and what waits shall be in its place. Everything can be said to be in its place only if everything participates in an orderly whole, whose configuration is in no danger of being altered by its parts. No independent causal agency, no even independent selves. The simple, compact, well-joined scheme. Myself disintegrated, everyone disintegrated, yet part of the scheme. This disintegration into a compact, well-joined scheme fits James Windrow's well, and even more so when combined with James's somewhat reluctant acknowledgement of just how duly ordered his divine Windrows might be in relation to what has arrived and what shall be. At the end of his life, responding to the compelling evidence for precognition, James asked, "Is consciousness already there, waiting to be uncovered? And is it a veridical revelation of reality?" This question, of course, bears directly on the consideration of God the circle, a circle without beginning or end. But given the pressure of illusory time in this talk, I can only give you a 1-minute image-only trailer of the kind of affirmative evidence that James was open to considering, and directly beseeched later generations to do the same. All of which are presented and commented on in my soon-to-be YouTube talk on Second Sight. The massive compelling evidence for both retrocognition and precognition, when combined with a Parmenidean Einsteinian block universe, a block universe very much in play among physicists, though not a rectangular block, but a circle, as both Einstein and Parmenides conceived it, as if the universe were indeed a cosmic mandala, the Sanskrit word for circle, compel us to consider, with James, that consciousness is indeed already there, waiting to be uncovered, and that, therefore, the confluently active radii of his windrows become confluently activated radial endpoints, serialized in place prior to activation. The one consciousness, already there, waiting to be uncovered, is divided functionally into the knowing and the known, with the knowing, Centerpoint, eternally activating the known circumference, as in the well-known 5 phenomenon, mostly now known as a symbol of frustration. Eternally activating because there is no unactivated catatonic universe, as the word block suggests. There is no movement without the backdrop of stillness, nor stillness without the backdrop of movement. Movement and stillness are codependent terms. As James's student and colleague Santayana duly noted, even if the realm of truth is indeed eternal and static, there must be something akin to an exploring spirit that may traverse it without adding, removing, or changing a single feature of that indestructible labyrinth. A recurring circular path, a path well suited for an internalistic block universe, and best suited for a circular one, has been acknowledged east and west for millennia. If one may believe the Pythagoreans, said Eudemus, considered the first historian of science, the same things will recur exactly, and I shall be holding my pointer and talking to you as you sit there, and everything else will be exactly as it is now. Another titan of Western philosophy, Nietzsche, joined Pythagoras in endorsing eternal recurrence, but there is a formidable obstacle to its re-embrace. St. Augustine, being only the most prominent church father to resist what he called, quote, those arguments with which the ungodly try to turn our simple piety from the straight road, and to make us join them in walking in circles. God forbid, I say, that we should swallow such nonsense. Christ died once and for all for our sins, and in rising from the dead, he is never to die again. He is no longer under the sway of death. But this is more pleading than reasoning, as it was with the other anti-recurrence church fathers before him. There is simply no cogent reason for banning the crucifixion from eternal recurrence, and thereby herding all of us into a linear path to salvation. After all, the Celtic cross may well reflect the fundamental Celtic myth, according to which time does indeed progress in a cyclical manner, so that events recur in an identical form exactly as they did the first time. But of course Augustine was hardly alone in his rejection of circularity. Judaism emphasized, if not introduced, linearity with Abraham went forth. As Thomas Cahill explains, for the Jews, history is always something new. The future will not be what has happened before. However inconvenient Ecclesiastes 1:9 is to that belief. The thing that hath been, it is that which shall be, and that which is done is that which shall be done, and there is no new thing under the sun. But perhaps belief in divine circularity is re-emerging, not a moment too soon. According to Jung, UFOs may be a projection of a psychic content of wholeness that has at all times been symbolized by the circle, and therefore an attempt by the unconscious collective psyche to heal the split in our apocalyptic age by means of the symbol of the circle. And finally, this. Just before COVID came to town, the Guggenheim Museum had its best attended show ever, the channeled art of Hilma af Klint. Painted by her in the first 2 decades of the last century, she says her hand was guided by a higher spirit, who informed her that her work was to be shown in a temple, though what that temple would be was not indicated, other than it would be a, quote, circular building where viewers would ascend a spiral path towards the sky. When this vision, recorded decades before the museum came into existence, even as an idea, was shared with the audience of the symposium held on the opening of the exhibition, an audible gasp was heard throughout the Guggenheim Auditorium. And, as frequently attends revelations of nonlinear time, perhaps even a few, "Oh my God." Thank you.